Hello.
Hello, good afternoon, good evening to you guys, Daniel, Inca. How are y'all?
I'm very good. Thank you for asking, Sergio. How are you?
Pretty good, pretty good. How are you, Inca?
Fine, thank you. Hope you don't mind. I'm still busy with my baking days, so I'll be um, preparing my currants today.
What are you making?
Currant meringue cake. Is
Ooh,
that
that
what you
sounds
call it? Yeah, I guess.
carrot cake.
No, currant, like these flowers here.
Oh, I don't
Oops.
even know what that is, but it looks good.
Yeah, I went and harvested them today with the neighbors. So
Well, that's great. That sounds really
extra
good.
fresh. Yeah.
I hope you can send me some.
They're not going to be fresh when they reach you.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's very true. Unfortunately. Well, I have been thinking a lot about a couple questions that I keep thinking each week, like, man, what are we going to talk about next? We've been talking about so much, and there's always more stuff to talk about. There's so many nuances to this work. There's so much to it that, I mean, we don't even know, but what we do know is still pretty vast. And even just taking from the work from the institute talks so much about other topics in consciousness and other modalities that people use on a day-to-day basis to improve their lives, whether it's managerial stuff, whether it's more long-term stuff. And I kind of wanted to touch on some of these topics that combine other modalities and what you guys have. But before we start, I have one question that throughout throughout the talk, I want to be able to unconsciously put in y'all's minds so that as we talk, your unconscious is kind of processing this and has this as a theme. And so the theme that I think would be interesting to hear from your perspective would be, what are some things as therapists, what is some advice that you've heard, that you hear on the mainstream, that you hear from other therapists, maybe in psychotherapy or in other modalities outside of trauma, in just regular mental health, that maybe is incorrect, things that we hear a lot that is talked about in regular public that maybe isn't the best advice, but we hear it right now as good advice. So I don't know. We could go into this if you want, but I feel like it's such a. I'm just throwing it out there. It's such a generalized thing that we may not. You guys may not have something that pops. You know, to the top of your head right now. But it would be cool to think about it as we talk in this conversation and see if these kinds of things show up. Something that for me shows up is we always think like, positive vibes only positive energy, only be positive and stuff like that. And it's, it's on t-shirts, it's everywhere. So things like that. Um, but I also wanted to really begin the chat with um, this idea that trauma can show up sometimes when people least expect it, right? Sometimes people are going through their life in a pretty well, and there are many triggers. There are things like a big event can trigger you into something deeper, like somebody dying, somebody passed away in your life. Sometimes meditation practices they tend to have these things. Some like transcendental meditation, these 10-day retreats can sometimes open up people to traumas they didn't know, and that wasn't even their intention. Drugs can do that as well. So what are some of the what happens when these things show up in people's lives? People might be going throughout their lives just fine, and then something happens, and then a bunch of stuff just opens up for them. What's going on there? Is that something you could talk to about a bit more?
Yeah, sure. So before we start there, let me just remember that the definition of trauma we are using, or the Institute for the Study of Peak States is using, is the definition of everything that doesn't feel calm, peaceful, and emotionally light. Okay, it's not like these big war accident and stuff that we are talking when we talk about trauma. It's also the smaller things when we get upset. That's what we call trauma. And when we do whatever practice, it might be a meditation practice, might be another healing modality practice, or just everyday life, we might get triggered into some traumas, basically remembering stuff that is inside of us, that has been stored inside of us. And then we feel it. And from the outside perspective, it might be that the outside thing was the cause of that trauma. The model that the Institute for the Study of Peak States created is more like that this is just some triggering, some remembering of something that has already happened during the creation phase of a human. So, okay, after or even before an egg and sperm came together and created a human being, the egg and the sperm themselves had been created, and sometimes these creation moments, these developmental events have not been without complications, and in these complicated moments, trauma has formed, and we have that in our body. And actually, say what you said at the beginning, that be positive is one of the things to look away, look the other side. So when we just look at the positives, we're trying to avoid looking at our negative feelings, and the negative feelings are actually these feelings when we are not calm, peaceful, and emotionally light. So we look away, and then when something brings these feelings back into our vision, then we are like, and we get startled, or we are getting afraid of stuff coming up, and and that is just something which was already inside of us. We just weren't aware of it, and now this event has made us aware. And now it depends on how we deal with that emotion, with how we deal with that event itself. If that's something we see as threatening and we might get fearful about it, or if we say, okay, something has happened and now I'm dealing with it, I have techniques to deal with it, and then we just continue living our lives.
Okay. Inka, is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would just like to add, or to make it a bit clear, to have the distinguishing between the trauma cause, like the moment the trauma was set, and the time where we relive the trauma because something triggers our system into these old memories, and those are unconscious memories, of course, usually.
Right.
Yeah. So there's the cause, and then the effect years and years and years and years later, and repetitive patterns very often. Yeah.
Right. That makes sense. It's just, I find it so strange that we can go, maybe Daniel, from a perspective of psychotherapy, I'm trying to remember the name, but I know, I think it's in psychoanalysis, there's a term, there's more than one term, but the one that comes to mind is called like the Return of Saturn. And there might be a better one, but it's this idea that there are certain moments in our lives, and they tend to be like in our I think like our late 20s, when some sort of life change happens, and it triggers us into these kinds of, it awakens kind of our trauma. And that's something that I've noticed a lot, like in especially with like schizophrenia and even bipolar disorder or some other disorders. There's always the idea that it happens when there's a major event happening, like when you turn 18 or 21. That's when you tend to see most people go into, unfortunately, go into these states in their lives for whatever reason. And I remember seeing on y'all's website the work of Dr. Clancy McKenzie, psychiatrist Clancy McKenzie, on I think he called it like delayed post-traumatic stress, which is essentially what you guys are saying, right? That there's these old traumas that happened, and then you kind of just forget about them. You forget about them, and they're just unconscious. And then something later on triggers that same feeling, triggers that kind of same response. And so you go back to that moment in time, and then you relive it. You're reliving that moment when you're a kid, and you're reliving it as if you were reliving it now. I think he was talking a bit more about it from a schizophrenia perspective, but he talked about it encompassing as that is what mental mental illness can be. That's one way of looking at it. And I think it's so, I don't want to say interesting, but it is interesting that is what happens, right? That sometimes I think life changes, like becoming an adult, like maybe going off on your own, moving for the first time. College does that for a lot of people. When you're becoming a woman, quote unquote, or a man, quote unquote, that's when these kinds of triggers show up. Yeah, I think it's really interesting, but I do wonder why, like, what's so strong about maybe going into transcendental meditation that it just brings it up for some people? Like, what's happening there that wasn't happening when, on a regular Tuesday when you're 20 years old and you just, it didn't happen then? Why, what are these practices doing that allows you to accidentally tap into these unconscious things?
Okay, well, these are many questions. Let me just start
Yeah.
with the beginning. I have no idea what the origin of psychiatric diseases is. Like this other guy said that he discovered it. I don't know, but I just have some viewpoints I would like to share. Actually, what you said, Sergio, with these certain moments when there's one stage of your life coming to the next stage of your life, that's something in psychology observed after birth. Okay, and then they say the first 8 years there's this phase where you just record everything, and then you start to use that knowledge that you recorded for the first 8-9 years. And that's something in the institute they also in the model they call developmental event or key developmental events, and they not only have happening after birth, they're also happening before birth. And typically these are the developmental events that are crucial for getting to the next stage or having the next peak state. We said that peak states of consciousness are states when the consciousness, when the body, when everything works in a better harmony, when there's better interaction between parts of us. And the institute found that when there's trauma in a certain key developmental event, then this blocks a peak state. So when with the peak states processes, you go back, you regress to these moments in your development, and then you heal these with a simple tapping technique. You heal these moments in development, and then when they are healed, when you feel calm, peaceful, and emotionally light in these moments, then you will get to the next level, to the next peak state. And what we see in before birth, we might also see after birth, when there are certain developments, when you start to walk, when you start to talk, when you start to go to school, when puberty and hits, and then you leave the house, and these are all developmental events in an adolescent. And when something goes wrong at that moment or just around that moment, that this has an impact on the next stage of that development. So that's the model in the institute. It's just prenatal, and now we can also I think we can apply it to understand what you were just saying about what psychology observed in after birth. Now I forgot the second part of the question. Sorry, what was it?
Yeah, it was a long question, wasn't it? I'm trying to remember myself. We were talking about, I think we were talking about primarily.
Now remember, you asked about why these transcendental meditation cause these triggers of trauma. I don't know, possibly because you're looking inside and you're looking inside into yourself, into your being, and you're just doing that in a perhaps not so well guided way, and then you stumble across something, and then you feel what's happening there. So when we say we relive the trauma, you said that we relive that moment in the past, that might sound strange for people because they say, well, I'm now 30 years old and I'm sitting here, and how can I relive something when I was 5, okay, when I fell off the bike? Yeah, and that is actually the confusing thing, because on the one hand, you are in 2021, 30 years old, sitting on a chair, but your feelings are from the past. So you feel that hurt in your knee, you feel that tummy ache because you got something in your tummy, but there's no correlation. So your mind is like, what's happening here? I feel something and nothing is there. There must be something really wrong with me. While it's not really wrong. It's just reliving a past moment which you could heal, and then these feelings would go away. Okay, so that's adds to the confusion. It's not like you have a time machine, you go back, and then you're like a small kid, and seeing everything from that perspective, you're actually older, yeah, and you're reliving the experience from them, but you're not that small kid. You don't have a time machine here.
Right, not yet. Okay, Inka, is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would just like to say that like you mentioned, so many different aspects from peak states to everyday life to mental health challenges to schizophrenia. That's a whole spectrum, and you have to look a little bit closer. What's the actual cause of it? Like most of the time when we're talking here, and what most people can probably relate to is those repetitive patterns when they get into situations that feel similar to something that they've already experienced in the past, or their body has experienced it in the past, and it gets triggered into the same feelings. Yeah. So that's kind of like the normal thing that most people experience in their lives, and it's not really considered a mental health challenge. In fact, most people consider it normal to have some kind of complaint and problem and not really feeling calm, peaceful, and physically light. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's kind of like a new thing for most people. Mm-hmm. But then we get into the realm where you say, like, okay, things like schizophrenia and so forth. And that's where we look at what we call structural damage. That is something where these developmental events led to a problem in your system that causes it to function less than optimal. Yeah. And that's where we get into this whole really like serious mental health challenges or problems to adapt to peak states. Because a peak state is essentially like experiencing a peak state permanently means that you've navigated developmental events successfully. Mm-hmm. Not having them means then in the reverse logic that something didn't quite go okay. It went well enough that you survived, obviously, but it didn't go as well as it could have. So you're missing that peak state. The peak state is like, how should I say? It's the sign that your organism is now functioning on a higher level.
Okay.
Yeah. Just something in development, kind of like you got an upgrade, and the next upgrade, and the next upgrade. Yeah. And it comes with a peak state, but the peak state is just a sign for that increased functionality.
Yeah.
Of your system. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Okay. Are there, when somebody's starting to work with you guys, when they're doing any sort of work, is it beneficial to come in with some sort of experience doing body work, doing meditation work, doing regular therapy? Are these things that complement the work you're doing? Because, we are dealing with people who are going to have to start working, very much in their bodies and sensing the things that are happening with them. Are they feeling crappy? Can they not feel? Are they numb? Some people, as we know, this isn't something that you go to school and learn. We already know that school doesn't really teach, at least out in the US. And, they're not teaching us like how do you feel? There's no classes on emotional intelligence, and there should be, but there isn't. Is there something that you need to kind of begin to strengthen as you start to do this work, or as you come in because you were in an abusive relationship and you have no idea why you get into abusive relationships? Is that all you need? You just need to know you were in an abusive relationship, or is there other things that are going to make it easier for you?
If I can go with this one, Daniel, in my experience, for example, people who do a lot of yoga, they often have very good access to their bodies, and they are attuned to their bodies and their sensations there, which makes it helpful. Mm-hmm. And attuned also to maybe the kind of energy flow that comes with the work that we're doing. What is often not so helpful if people have done other kind of modalities that cause them to analyze and explain and interpret stuff all the time, or they're from a school where abreaction is the goal of the whole thing, and you just strengthen and basically like multiply your negative feelings by focusing on them too much and acting them out rather than feeling where are they actually coming from in your body. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So say like instead of feeling your anger not in your gut, they go yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Nothing happened. All good. So
You're
so
just
that,
abreacting, no big deal.
yeah. It's just demonstrating. Okay, so that would be less than helpful because it teaches them the wrong habits, and then they have to unlearn these things first. And honestly, it's a pain in the behind.
So can you describe abreaction a bit more as you explained it? And this is a topic that I've read about here and there. You're actually physically expressing this internal sensation that you're feeling or this emotion, but you're not fully. Are you just trying to let it go? Is that what abreaction is? You're trying to let it go by expressing it.
I would say you'd have to look at it a little bit in the context of how psychology and all these techniques that are going along or accompanying it evolved. Like our society was, or at least the Western society was very suppressive of any emotions. Mm-hmm. So even being aware of emotions was a huge step forward. And I'm not disputing that huge step. I'm just saying that's not the end all.
Right.
Yeah. That's just okay. Now finally we can feel what's going on.
Yeah.
But now it's the next step, just feeling it and letting it out. And that kind of letting it out is just exhausting you, but it's not helping you to actually resolve the problem.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Like if you've cried enough, and if you shouted enough, and if you've hammered enough, at some point your system's going to say, yeah, okay, I'm done now. But the story isn't done. The problem is going to resurface.
Okay.
Except for that very, very rare case where people really fully experienced it in their body at the same time, and then it might be done. However, that's hardly ever the case. I think I mentioned before that I've done my rebirthing training, which is using some intentional abreaction techniques.
Yeah.
Completely out of body, or without ever noticing the difference of being in body and out of body.
Right. Yeah, you've mentioned a bit on that.
Yeah. So that big difference is really not something that's widely known. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
And the interesting thing is what Inka just said, this re-experiencing or exposition training. That's something also in regular psychotherapy is happening, and the results are varied. They vary very strongly from patient to patient and from case to case. And one of the very, very important things is what Inka just said, being in body, and then repeating that, and then there might be a chance that the healing occurs, but it's time consuming, and it's really painful to really confront you with the situation you're fearful of and so on. So that's why the tapping techniques we are using, I think they're more efficient. Yeah, I'm not saying they're better or worse or something. I just say they're, from my point of view, more efficient to deal with these things. And but it's important that you can feel something inside of you. Okay, when you're so scared of your emotion, when you're so scared of life that you can't feel, that you can't allow yourself to feel things, then it's with any healing modality to go ahead. So then the first step is, okay, it's okay to feel emotions. Okay, they're part of your life, and they're not wrong, and they're actually very, very, very valid. From growing up, many people might have experienced that parents said, no, you're not feeling this, okay, because they didn't want that emotion to be there because it would have triggered their emotions. And so that many people have been grown up with learning that emotions are not okay. So yes, to be able to do the work, the first step is to accept that emotions are okay and that you have emotions in your body. And then from that, you go further. Okay. And something comes into play there that the Institute for the Study of Peak States calls the center of awareness, or the awareness, or the body awareness, whatever you want to call it. The technical term in the Institute is Center of Awareness, or abbreviation COA. And that is the part of your awareness where you feel something. And that can be either outside of your body, something here, so you're standing beside yourself, you're dissociated, or you have it inside your body, or you have it like just in the head. It's comfortable to have it in the head because the head, there's not so much pain, okay? There's just thoughts and not pain. And the lower you go, the better you feel your body, the better you're embodied, basically. And you can do the healing, but it also means that when you have trauma in the body, you feel it. And one way to escape trauma quickly is just to go away, not to heal it, just to
go somewhere else where you don't feel it. Yeah. That's probably why we live so much in our heads. At least I can speak to it from an experience of having to move back down. It's difficult, especially after a while. There are two things I wanted to talk to really quick about what you guys talked about. The first one is directed to you, Inka, which is maybe if you're able to, this idea that you were able to abreact, which means you were feeling, but then you said you were also out of your body. How does that work specifically? Because it sounds like you were feeling stuff, but at the same time, you weren't in your body. So is this kind of like a split consciousness thing where you were somehow, you're slightly aware that you are having feelings, but is it kind of like what Daniel was saying? You just went somewhere else in your body, or you went outside of your body to not feel it completely?
I would say at that time I was afraid of my feelings and afraid of feeling, and that fear made me go out of body. And then at the same time, I was supposed to feel something. So I went into that, okay, now I have to bring this up and act it out in something, and to the point where it then starts happening automatically. And yes, maybe you could even call that like a split awareness or something. I'm pretty sure it's not very healthy, and I think it will form a tendency to create like additional trauma, rather. Not create it, but re-traumatize is the terminology here. So you're creating another one of those moments, repetitive pattern moments, with the same set of feelings, but since it wasn't lived and experienced and accepted to that calm, peaceful, and lightness, but rather to exhaustion, sort of. You didn't really resolve it.
What I'm sure you guys are talking to topics that are really important and really common for most people. You're saying, you didn't feel those things completely. We're not taught about this. We're actually taught to not feel them so much. Our parents teach us because unconsciously they might not want to feel those things because they don't know how to handle it, so they can't be there for us. So how are we supposed to get better at those things if they are in some ways taught and in some ways unconscious responses? How did you get better at being present with your feelings enough to be in your body without them, unconsciously taking you out because they get overwhelming so fast, or because they're just, terrifying or too painful? How do you get better at that?
Well, for me, there was definitely a big shift when I realized that emotions come with physical sensations. And emotions are not something that will stay forever. Once you allow yourself to feel those emotions along with the physical sensations, sometimes it's even enough to just stick with these physical sensations. It just becomes so much easier because, okay, at some point, as long as I don't try to make it go away, it will go away. That's the paradox here.
Okay.
Yeah, and I would like to add, of course, at the beginning it's really difficult, and depending on the stage you might be in, it might be too overwhelming to do it alone. So it might be a good idea to do that together with a therapist in a safe space, basically, where you feel safe that you can allow these emotions. But there's depending on the upbringing, there are people who are, for example, very afraid of their emotions, and they know when they feel the emotions, they're automatically starting to cry. And because of whatever they have been taught when they were a child, crying in front of people, or crying in front of people of the family, or crying in front of people of strange people is not okay. Okay, you shouldn't show weakness in face of other people, or whatever beliefs they have been implanted to, and then it's difficult. Okay, and so yeah, be prepared if you have emotions that crying starts. For me, crying is a way of, it's a very good way of letting emotions flow out. Okay, it's basically a security valve. When the emotions are too high, you start out to cry, and that can be really, really relieving. And have some tissues prepared, and then you go from there. But when you think it's too much and too overwhelming, you should get the help of a therapist and not try it alone at home, please.
Right. And also to that, yeah, I think it's important to say that, you know, this expression of your feelings is still pretty important, especially when you're reaching a moment that is like too overwhelming, because it does tend to calm your activate your parasympathetic nervous system. So it does calm you down, and that sometimes can be, you know, really important. I want to talk about re-traumatization, like you just mentioning a little bit more, because I guess I could be thinking of the wrong word, but I thought it meant two things. So you're activating something, and you kind of are stacking a little bit more into it by being outside of your body. That's one way I thought about it. But I remember, and correct me if I'm wrong, just going off because it's such a important word in the trauma field, and I feel like I've seen it used differently. I've seen it used as like you become overwhelmed with your feelings because things pop up. Then there's what you just added, which is you're actually adding a little bit more trauma by being out of your body and not processing how you felt at that moment. And I think in some fields, in some aspects of the trauma field, there's, especially with you guys, I've seen it as when you start doing this work, because your body is so not used to healing, things just show up. Things start waking up. They're like, hey, we're healing. Like, it's like, heal me next. Like, I'm here too. Like, I've been feeling like shit about this for a couple of years. Like, and then all this stuff that you had kind of managed to, you know, life happens and you're like, fuck, I got to deal with this. Sorry about the cussing. Shoot, I got to deal with this I'll deal with this in like a month, or I'll deal with this next week, because right now I have a big project, or I have to do this for work, or, you know, like I can't worry about this thing in my relationship right now. I'll just go watch TV. And then you kind of you just push it away, or you stack it here and you stack it there. And then when you start healing, and this happened to me one of the first times we did, I did a session with Daniel, like, it went great. I felt this wave of relaxation. The process ended beautifully. I felt great. And then like a few hours later, all this stuff I hadn't felt in forever just came up, and I was just feeling like crap. And I didn't understand. So I remember going back to the book, and I was like, what's going on? Like, what does this mean? And then, you know, Daniel was like, sometimes, you know, things might pop up. So I wanted to talk about, for people who are, you know, thinking about doing this work, it's also not just, sometimes it can be a one-off thing where you just have one thing you want to deal with. But sometimes, you know, most of life tends to be you got to deal with a couple of things, and that might pop up and it might confuse people. So that was kind of long, but could you talk a little bit more about re-traumatization and this aspect of traumatology?
Okay, so let me just quickly clarify. What you experienced is not re-traumatization in our terms. We call that trauma flooding. Yeah.
flooding. Okay.
Trauma
Okay.
flooding. And it's
Flooding.
exactly that thing. Yeah. You healed something successfully, and your system says, yay, that's great. Let's do the rest also. And then everything, kind of like queues up and overwhelms you that has been standing in the wings. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So
Two different
that's
terms.
trauma flooding. Now, retraumatization is when through more or less inappropriate ways of re-experiencing a trauma, rather than healing and eliminating it, you create just another one of those repetitive, like one of these patterns in the stack. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think we talked about it before, that the repetitive pattern type of trauma is characterized by the same kind of emotions and physical sensations in the body, triggered by trying to cope with a particular type of situation. And by recreating the situation, the scenario in therapy, and not having those key elements in place that make sure that you really eliminate the problem at the root, you just add another one of those. Like you add the same type of thing. You're not adding a little bit of trauma to it. You're creating another one of those repetitive moments. Yeah, because the same feelings, the same sensations in the body, and you're trying to cope with the situation and you can't. That's essentially what causes the trauma to, like, the whole system to get stuck. Yeah, because you lack the means to cope with the situation. And until you add these particularly very vital ingredients, you're not going to get anywhere, and you're just adding one after the other. One of the ingredients we already mentioned, being in body.
Yeah.
And the second one is knowing how to regress to the origin.
Okay.
Of the trauma. Yeah.
Okay. There are some traumas that are different than others, though, right? There are some that aren't so straightforward, that maybe I know that with the work you guys do, some of them are, I think you've mentioned like 70%, once you understand how to do them, you might be able to tackle them yourself, but some aren't. And that might be confusing to some people, so I'll speak to it on my behalf, which is, we've talked a bit with Daniel about like bugs, which are these sensations where like the feeling you get is maybe not something you should actually focus on, because like I have some of the few things that I deal with, some of them are like this burning sensation, this like prickling burning sensation, and the more I focus on it, the more intense it gets. It doesn't seem to feel better, it doesn't seem to calm down, or even calm down for that matter. There are some things where if I'm feeling like a sensation, I might focus on that, and then eventually it calms down, like you mentioned, Inka. But there are some like those where they don't. So there are things that are different, right? Different types of traumas.
I wouldn't call that even a trauma. Those are just parts of ourselves that are unfortunately heavily invested in not changing anything. Yeah. So when you're actually making a difference, when you start doing something to change your system for the better, those parts pop up and say, wait a minute, no, I don't think I want that. And they cause all kinds of weird symptoms, basically, in order to stop you from what you're doing.
Okay. So those aren't traumas themselves. They're kind of like inhibitors, so to speak.
That's a good term for it. Yeah.
Okay. And those are more for like, if that's happening to you, then you should. But does this usually happen then only when you're trying to work on yourself?
Well, yeah, in most cases, yeah. In most cases, it's really trying to make a change, and actually achieving a change is when they show up.
but it not necessarily when you are working on yourself only. But for example, if you're in your workplace and there's a project you really like, and then eventually you learn that this is not the most favorite project in the company, and you still want to do it, and then you're basically running against closed doors, and you're just doing it, and then eventually you might feel like some heaviness on your shoulders or something like this, or what you said, a burning sensation. So these might be some mechanisms showing up, and where basically the system says don't do that, don't go against the company's policy, or don't go against the group's opinion, and something like this. And that's really a problem. One can say that's a company's culture problem, but it's a problem if a company wants to be innovative, okay? Because innovation means something has not been done, and innovators are people who take the risk of being false, or creating something which doesn't work. Yeah. And that's what usually what our society has brought forwards. But innovation is the opposite of stability, yeah? And that's the key part of innovation. And so this stability versus innovation is always a struggle. And I think that's why just certain people like Steve Jobs and so on just created something and brought something, and with taking the risk of being on the wrong side.
That makes sense. Okay. So when you feel these things, do they usually feel like do you feel those voices, or do you just feel like the sensations kind of push you away from that?
That depends very much on the person themselves, and that depends on, for example, what I said about the center of awareness. That depends where the center of awareness is. From that point on, you perceive it. So when your center of awareness is in your head, you have a different perception as when you're in the body or when you're out of the body. So that's really relative on how you perceive something. And in therapy, there are some diagnosing questions we have, and then we basically try to understand the situation of that person to help them deal with their situation. Please don't do it alone, okay? Please don't go in anything which is black or which is burning, or don't put your attention in there. You're gonna feel miserable, and it's not pleasant. That's something you should just talk to a therapist too.
Got it. Okay, good to know for everyone out there listening to this. If anybody's got any questions at any point, go ahead and ask. We're happy to answer any of your questions. I want to go back to what we said at the beginning and see if our unconscious processing has been popping up with any ideas on that. So what we talked about earlier was, what is some advice out there, some pieces of advice you hear about mental health, about psychology, that is mainstream and is talked about as if it's a good advice, but isn't necessarily the best thing for our mental health in general, for healing, for understanding how we can feel better and get better, and just self-improvement in general. Is there anything that's come to mind for you guys?
Yeah, I have something. Well, we had that thinking positive, okay? And we talked about that it's just basically seeing just half of the truth and not the full truth. And so that's something I don't think that's really helpful. In certain moments, it's okay. Like you said, there's a moment where you have to power through, and then you might be able to motivate yourself to power through, and to then take a break and open your vision up, okay? But one of the other things, which is not necessarily like a proverb advice, but I think you find it very often on TikTok and YouTube and Instagram and so on, is that you should widen your comfort zone, okay? And the thing is, with the comfort zone, it's your comfort zone. So that's the area around you. That's what you do, your habits and so on, where you feel comfortable and where you feel confident to work in. And if somebody says you have to widen it, basically they're just saying, well, I don't accept the way you are right now. I'm invalidating you, and you have to change, okay? And I think that's not really motivating if that is behind it. There's a reason why we have that comfort zone, because we know that this works. So if we want to be able to use a new computer project or use a new program and so on, we have to motivate ourselves. If the motivation comes from the outside, basically it's pressure. Okay, the outside motivation is pressure, and is not really helpful. Sometimes we give in to that pressure because we want that paycheck at the end of the month or the end of the next 2 weeks. But it's never that sustainable and never makes that happy of an employee, happy of somebody who has widened their comfort zone. Is when you talk to that person and say, okay, try to understand their reasons why their comfort zone is just this way and not bigger. Okay, everybody has reasons. Okay, they might just say, okay, I made 10 experiences that are good this way, and I made 5 experiences that were bad that way. Okay, so that's why I stay with the 10. Okay, and I mean, that's logical. Okay, but it might be not helpful for them to live that way, because they might be missing out. They might be missing out on, I don't know, meeting a partner outside, or they might be missing out on getting a better job or getting a higher salary. For example, if your parents never told you might ask for a raise, you might not do it. Okay, and it feels comfortable not doing it, but
right.
Why should anybody give you more money if you don't ask for it? Okay, so this might be a very good example of a helpful widening of your comfort zone, and then you just talk to that person and see, okay, what are your reasons for not asking for it? And then usually people respond, well, I could be fired, I could be seen greedy, I could be whatever. Every person has their own reasons for them. And then you, on the one hand, you can discuss them. Okay, that's usually done in normal therapy. Or you could say, okay, how does it feel if you would do it? Okay, what's the emotion? What's the sensation behind? We already talked about that. And usually it feels bad in a way, negative, something. And then that means, since you're not feeling calm, peaceful, and emotionally light, that's trauma. Okay. And when you heal that trauma, then widening your comfort zone is easy. Okay, because you're not stopped by that strong fear or strong emotion that was there before, because it's gone then. And then you have widened the comfort zone without any practicing and training and redoing, pushing through. Right, that's the one. Yes, but you have done it in a very gentle way, and just because the tapping has been done by the person themselves, because of their inner motivation. There might have a trigger, there might have been an event or something from the outside, but the widening itself has been done by the person.
Okay, that makes sense. So in this way of thinking about it, then, well, like we said, pushing through is you pushing through some kind of trauma response that doesn't let you, that keeps your comfort zone, within what isn't traumatic. That's a good way of thinking about it. Inka, before I say anything else, is there anything you want to add to that? Do you have any you want to fight the status quo on what we think about good advice, good mental health advice?
Oh yeah, there's tons. I think I already mentioned something, that believing that acting out an emotion is actually processing and healing it. That's a fallacy.
Yeah, it's a big one.
Then the next one is, trust your gut feelings. Your gut feelings are actually also trauma-based, by the way.
We were just talking about this like 30 minutes ago with Danny.
Okay. So that's another one.
Can you talk a bit more about that? For most people, that's going to be like, what do you mean? I mean, so I shouldn't trust my gut? Because I know for me, it saved my butt a couple of times. So now, did it save my butt or did it not? And I'm wrong. How do you know? Or I mean, because I feel like this goes back to the body brain, right? Like associations taught us what's safe and what's not. And we've already mentioned that some of these associations are erroneous, and you might assume that something's bad for you, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's bad for you. You just associated it as bad because of some event. Are you saying all gut feelings are wrong?
That could be one aspect of your so-called gut feelings. Yeah. Or it could just be regular trauma that comes up when you think of a particular way of dealing with something or having to deal with something. Yeah. Basically, it's a way to avoid things.
Okay.
And then there's actually true intuition. Yeah. And that's the kicker. How do you tell the difference?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the key would be again feeling calm, peaceful, and emotionally light, like physically light, like not heavy, not weighed down, not activated
Okay.
in any way, and still having that feeling, that could be a good idea. And maybe I should go somewhere else, not board this plane or not take that road. Those would be real intuitions, and that would be helpful. Yeah.
Okay. So the more you heal, does it become easier? It feels like one of those things. It might become easier.
Yeah, I mean, most people, like I said, don't have a clue what it feels like to be calm, peaceful, and emotionally light. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So that would be the first step to learn how to do that, or to increase the time that you spend in that very pleasurable condition. That would be the first step to go for telling the difference between the gut feelings that are trauma based and your real intuition.
Okay. Hey, FYI, I think your camera is off. Just letting
Yeah,
you know.
I just didn't want to take you long into the kitchen. Sorry, I'm still
no worries.
multitasking here.
No worries. Okay. Well, you were gonna mention another one. There was another status quo dispelling thing. You were gonna say something else.
Analyzing your feelings. Analyzing. Oh, I'm doing this because my mother always failed to do this and this and this.
So psychotherapy.
My parents invalidated my feelings, and that is why I'm a mess today. Sorry. That is not helpful in any way. It rather alienates you from your parents, if anything. And people who do this throughout when we're trying to heal, it's really difficult to make any progress with them because they're just mentally rationalizing their problem instead of really going to the feeling, the root of what happened.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. As somebody who did 7 years of psychotherapy or 5 years of psychotherapy, like 5 or 6, I totally get that. It's a good mechanism, and it's but yeah, and you think you're doing progress, especially when you feel stuck. When you feel stuck doing this work, when you feel stuck doing any kind of somatic, I don't want to say energetic, but like somatic, emotional kind of work, when you feel stuck, whatever that may mean, that's the go-to. It feels like that's going to get you out of that rut. Like, okay, so something's not happening, so might as well use my brain to figure it out. And maybe, just maybe, if I associate it with why I feel this way, then I'll move forward. That's like the next logical thing. So that's really interesting you speak on that. But at the same time, it's because it's one of the main tools we have right now in modern therapy, right? Like, we're getting to a point where psychotherapy is, and even regular therapy is, accepting more that more of our feelings come from earlier events. And I guess in this scenario, we can talk about biographical events. And we've mentioned this before, right? It's our parents failed us, or or our bully made us feel this way when we were younger, or just somebody did something. And while that may be true, it's also important to keep in mind that at this point there are feelings, and they're not residing with them, they're residing with us. So you can blame,
very, very important point. Yes.
yeah, you can blame them, but ultimately the feelings are with us. So whether you're angry about it, it's still our responsibility, whether we want to accept that as our responsibility or not. And only because we're empowered by that. We're empowered by the fact that while it sucks that we have it, we're the ones that will get rid of it if we want to. We're the ones that have the power to make the choices about them. And yeah, I mean, as much as you want to blame somebody, whether it's their fault or not, or whether they helped you feel like this, they're not going to take that away from you. It's up to you to kind of let go of those things. And unfortunately, blaming doesn't make that happen.
Yes, it's right.
It's
As
a
long as you
shame,
still
but
have a need to blame, you have something to heal.
yeah, of course, of
And
course.
the thing is, I think for our minds, it's very difficult to understand that there is something that it can't comprehend. Okay, so whenever there is a logical explanation, it somehow can numb down the pain. But as long as there is no explanation, the pain is there and it's noticeable. And but when I have that explanation, okay, then it's okay basically. So I can put my attention somewhere else. Perhaps that's an old mechanism which is inside us that says, okay, when I know the origin of the pain, I can dedicate my awareness to something else. But as long as I don't know it, I have to experience the pain. I don't know, but that's something. Yeah, not really helpful, as Inka pointed out. Just I would like to discuss the part that modern psychotherapy is doing it differently. Okay, the acceptance and commitment therapy is very much mindfulness based, so where we are see that emotions are there and we can experience emotion and to learn to deal with emotions and not to suppress them. And as well in schema therapy, there are many techniques in schema therapy to activate emotions and to work with them in a certain way. Okay, so that's
Mm-hmm.
just, I'm not saying good or better or worse or anything there. It's just a certain way how emotions are confronted. And there is also some regressing back to moments, not prenatal, but after birth in schema therapy. But you work with emotions and it's not just all mind-based thinking.
Okay, thank you for that. So you're saying there's more, beyond just psychotherapy. There's more modalities that are focusing more on your emotions, more and on being present
Yes.
and
Yeah.
mindful,
I mean,
as well as
that's called
chemotherapy.
the third wave, third or fourth wave. I forgot. I think fourth wave of cognitive behavioral therapy, which is now entering the emotional space, and it's still pretty early, so it's not that trauma based, not that model that the institute has, and I'm not sure if perhaps they will converge one day into hopefully a even bigger and better model. But it's I think it takes the right turn to not just talk about it, but also experience them and not be afraid
Yeah,
of emotions.
of course. That's great. That's really great to hear. That leads me to a quick question about mindfulness. I mean, mindfulness has been going strong for some decades now, and this idea of being with the emotions, being mindful. Why isn't that enough to heal? Because mindfulness is a very hot. Uh, it's very hot right now. I don't know how else to put it, but you see it everywhere. You go to. I took a class on mindfulness when I was in college, and that was wow, it's almost a decade, but not yet. And like, why wasn't that enough for me? Why wasn't that enough for other people? Why is mindfulness is being present with how you're feeling and what's going on with you? So why aren't mindfulness meditations? Why aren't people leaving like, wow, I healed from my breakup for 4 years ago. It looks like I was still holding on to some things. What's happening there?
Well, it's not really kind of me, but I'm just doing it anyway. Don't please be mad about it. Um, Tell me about it. Why are you not mindful? Why are you still thinking about emotions of the past? Why are you why do you have ruminating thoughts, and why that person that you just put an example is holding on to that in the past? If that person would be mindful, they would be just in the present and would say, no, that was in the past. I don't care about it. I'm just caring about watching our video here.
Gotcha.
And so why is that? What's inside of us that drags us back? And do you want to answer that, or should I just give my
All you, go ahead.
okay, good. And I think there are at least two things to it. The first of all is um, conditioning. Okay, I've been doing that my whole life. Okay, and it has been somehow not really pleasant, but perhaps there's some, if I have ruminating thoughts, there might be this clue, and now I solved all my problems. So I'm trying to reach that point. And the other thing is that I'm actually stuck in trauma. And since we know that trauma is is experiencing something from the past, you are stuck in the past. You're stuck with your emotions, sensations in the past. And to get unstuck, somebody has to get you to now. And we have talked about the space clearing exercise, I think, in the last webinar, which is an exercise to get you out of your trauma and get more into the present moment. And that's why people experience that as a relief, because in the present moment, usually there's not so much going on, and that's more pleasant than being stuck in the past. And it's really difficult. Yeah, the conditioning, the being. It's normal to think about things. So every viewer, please think about when you're walking down the street. Are you enjoying the street? Are you looking at the pavement? Are you looking for a bee flying around, or are you just on your phone and doing some work? Or when you just walk, are you thinking about what's going to happen next when you arrive at your destiny? Okay, I think the latter one is what most people experience, and fewer people are really mindful about the next step. Okay, how they put their feet and what they experience around themselves, because they have a goal. They're hustling to a goal, and they're not here in that moment enjoying every next step in the path.
Okay, so part of it is conditioning.
That makes sense.
To an extent, because I guess maybe I had a little bit off. It's been a while. Mindfulness tends to be the practice of just staying in the present, right? Of being mindful of what's going on around you. So it doesn't necessarily include being present with what's going on inside you, just what's presently, maybe your external world, like being in the moment.
Yeah.
So something being present inside of you would kind of take you out of that if you are dealing with trauma, right?
Right. If you're dealing with trauma and you're in trauma, basically you're not in the current in the now. You're just somewhere in the past. Okay. When you're like experiencing some heartache and something about the breakup, and you still feel it inside, and you walk down the street, you feel that, and then you're not in the present. Yeah. You're just with the emotions in the past for that heartache. And if you would be in the present, it would be different. Okay? And but it's so difficult to get you out. Okay, it's somehow magnetic to stay in the pain.
Yeah. Okay. So is mindfulness beneficial at all though to trauma healing, or no, not really?
Well, if it's really just being present to what's going on around you, I have my doubts, honestly. If you're present to both what's around you and what's inside you, and you're able to maintain that, that would basically be the peak state of being present, and maybe you can work yourself into that. There's a little way you can test that, actually. If you're able to perceive more than 180 degrees of the space in front of you, then you'd be close to that.
You can perceive, so you can kind of perceive what's behind you. Okay.
Bummer.
Yeah. I can do it a little bit, but not really. Okay.
Yeah, so if you would add that to the mindfulness practice, then I think it would have a very good effect.
Cool.
How many cables are hanging behind you, Sergio?
I don't know. I can do it by memory, but that's about it. I can, but so when you're saying perceiving, are you saying like you can imagine it, so to speak? Like you can.
No, your awareness encompasses all of the space inside you and around you.
Oh, okay. Okay.
But that's the full being present state, as the institute stated that it exists. We currently don't have a process to bring you into that state, but people are in that state, and and that's how we know.
Interesting. Okay, that's really interesting. Would that make people more like spatially aware? Would that make them better at sports? I feel like, does that have to do with spatial intelligence a bit, or kinesthetic intelligence?
Maybe kinesthetic intelligence, yeah. But more importantly, actually, the perception, especially the hearing, seems to get better.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. That's really
So you
interesting.
can't be present.
Don't use that as a way to fix your tinnitus or your
No.
deafness or whatever. That's not the way to go about this. Yeah.
Got it.
And and don't brag about being present state, because otherwise your wife will always tell you what to do.
Why?
Because you can't say I didn't hear it. I'm sorry.
Oh, gotcha.
Oh, is that what's going on? Did you just let slip one of the secrets of the Brotherhood?
There's one topic that I've been wanting to talk about for some time, and it came to me because I was watching something this week, and it is we've been talking a lot about falling into these dynamics or these relationships that are unconscious for the most part because they're trauma based, and I don't know if you guys have HBO, but this past year there was a documentary that came out on HBO Max called The Vow, and it tended to do with it was a topic on cults. It was talking about cults, and it was primarily speaking on the subject of this specific cult that was, I forgot if it was in the US or Canada. I think it was in the US, and just a story of how this it was they called it like an executive success program, right? And it was this organization that helped people with self-help and self-improvement, and recent and the guys in jail at this point, it came that it was a very horrible cult. They had some like very, very, very nasty practices. And just recently I saw another topic this week on cults, and they were talking about Jim Jones and some of the other big cults. And are you familiar with Jim Jones by chance? He was a pastor, or he was a quote unquote pastor who took people from the US to Jonestown, Guyana, and he took people to the US, and they lived there for about 1,000 people. And essentially families back home were starting to worry about them, and ultimately it led in the biggest like mass murder suicide. All these people basically like killed themselves over there because this guy commanded it. So I'm just gonna summarize it. And it's a really intriguing topic that people will maybe join these cults without knowing they're cults, and it happens sometimes when they're going through a big transition in life, when something terrible is happening. There's a charismatic leader. There's a lot of things, but it does. When we first started these chats, I happened to join one on Clubhouse, and they were talking this one. It was specifically on the trauma of like religious trauma and religious cults, and people escaping and trying to reestablish their lives after it. And it just got me to thinking, like, where is there any research that you guys on the institute have seen regarding cults, have seen regarding joining these these institutions that help you create an identity, and then it becomes who you are, and it just makes you maybe make bad choices in your life based on these collective groups? Because I feel like it relates to Silent Mind a bit, but I would love to hear anything you guys have to bring about this topic, if there's anything. It's a really interesting social psychology aspect to who we are. It's just so strange.
I'm not 100% versed in the cults and the social psychology. What you were saying, I just picked up what you were explaining, and there were two things that I picked up. The first one is I'm looking for something defining me in the outside. Okay, so I think prerequisite. What's that? Prerequisite for joining a cult is to not look inside of you, what defines yourself, but looking for somebody outside to define you. Okay. you are, I don't know, the greatest programmer, the greatest whatever engineer, and so on, and therefore you can do this or whatever. But being not self-conscious, self-aware, having not a good self-awareness of oneself, but trying to get that from the outside, I think that's a vulnerability. And then the second one is what you said, is the need for identification, the need for identifying with something, okay? To be a member of whatever society, to be a proud member of whatever society. These are all vulnerabilities one needs to have to be able to join. Unfortunately, these are very common, these vulnerabilities, okay? And within the Institute, there are certain processes for example, the column of self, which helps you to get a more stable sense of yourself, okay? And there are other things like identities or fake identities, which we all find in the therapist books, which are problems identified, and that you can work on, and so that the need, for example, for external identification decreases. Okay, but they're all linked together. Okay, if you're not very sure about yourself, you want to define yourself, you want to get some, okay, and I'm that teacher, and there's a correlation within the primary cell to these problems. Inka, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, there may be some of that to it. I think it's probably also quite easy to get corded into something like that. Yeah, there's one particular trauma that attaches via that complementary trauma mechanism to one of the leading figures in that cult. And you get kind of roped in literally with that. And after that, you might be right that the tribal block mechanism kicks in, yeah, that you have to do what all the others are doing. You're kind of like not having much of a choice to do things differently than those of that new group that you find yourself in.
Yeah, that makes sense. One thing that I think about is, though, that as humans, we are hardwired to socially connect, correct? We're social animals. That's something that we hear everywhere. So when we're talking about tribal block, and when we're talking about, this need for connection and maybe even identity, while I feel like it's safe to say that identity can sometimes be a mechanism to not feel lonely, and it can certainly be something that's not always helpful. It does give us stability, but when we are not able to, when we don't feel like we're part of a tribe or a culture, are we not more prone to feel more lonely or more disconnected from the world? Specifically talking about something like not having tribal block, right? Do you feel like you're just disconnected from the world, like you're just by yourself, or what happens then? So if somebody heals this block.
You're absolutely right. When you have a certain trauma, and you feel lonely, and you can either heal that trauma, feel lonely, or try to cover up that trauma by courting with somebody else who has the need to feel like an overfather to you, okay? And then you don't feel that loneliness underneath. But it's a little bit like the trauma and the instinct, okay? So when you feel inside, you might feel trauma, or you might feel your instincts, and your instincts might save you, or your trauma might bring you into trouble. And the same is true for this being a social animal. Yes, we are social and we love to stay in groups, but when we stay in groups that are so tightly connected, that are corded with each other, then that's like Christmas for families. It's stressful, okay? And why should we have a stressful life? And you can experience living in groups without that courting, which is actually very pleasant, and it's a different feeling. So when clients come together who have that silent mind done, it's a complete different way of meeting, and the conversations are different than when people come together that don't have it.
Okay, that makes sense. But you just feel like your relationships are more healthy. You don't feel like overly unhealthily tied to these relationships, is what you're saying. Oh, Okay, that makes sense.
And if it's the other way around, even if you're having a big loneliness trauma, you will be using the tribal block mechanism to compensate for that trauma. Well, that makes it actually difficult to get rid of the tribal block.
Gotcha. So you don't want to let go of that. That makes you
Yeah,
feel better.
it's a dysfunctional way of relating, and you're using a dysfunctional mechanism to not feel that problem.
Right.
And
Yeah, that makes a lot of
unfortunately, two
sense.
minuses don't make a plus here. So
Yeah.
it's rather making the problem worse. Yeah.
That's really incredible. I find that specific dynamic. Excuse me. I find that specific dynamic really, really interesting because there are so many groups out there, and there's just it's just a very from a psychological perspective, from a somebody who studied psych, like I find it very sad, but also very intriguing. You know, it's like a very intriguing that this happens on such a large scale. This need to feel like a savior or to identify with something that will make you feel a certain way, and we all do it to some extent, but that is pretty intense. Since we're talking about tribal block again, and I feel like we always gravitate to this specific topic. I feel like it's a really important topic, and it's because most people deal with this, and maybe we've talked about this, but I feel like it's good to bring it up a little bit from time to time because you never know who's listening, and they may listen to this and be like, oh, that was really interesting, and they maybe never would have if they never found chat number 10 or number 8. But a lot of us have dysfunctional, not completely, but some dysfunction in our families, in our family systems, which are our most important systems, and they're the people that we've known the longest, the ones we love the most. Everybody has issues. Everybody has something they don't like about each other, or they have some clash. How does that tribal block, how does letting go of that tribal block make your relationships or improve them, especially with family? Sometimes you want your family to be this way, or sometimes you want your brother to be this way, your sister to be this way, your mom or your dad, etc. And sometimes they want you to be this way. How does being able to let go of that tribal block, healing that aspect, shift things?
Yeah, I always advertise tribal block as the Christmas gift for the whole family.
Okay, that makes sense. So a lot less dysfunction. In general, there's less triggering.
Well, there is this saying of people pushing your buttons, and that's actually what then seizes. Okay, so people knowing exactly what to say to get you off or get you nervous or get you anxious or whatever. So when people know you, they're around you, your coworkers or your family, they see you subconsciously. They note everything. That's even though they don't notice it consciously, they subconsciously notice it, and then eventually they get an idea. If I say this word now, then he will freak out, and that is basically pushing the buttons. And so there you very, very possibly have a cording, and then you have that situation. And so when and the retaliation actually is the problem. When somebody does something to me, subconsciously I'm doing something to them, and then it gives that ping pong, and then Christmas isn't that nice, or the coming together isn't that nice, and that's what this silent mind process gets rid of, and then life changes. You're not completely healed, and you're not enlightened, and so on. There's still other mechanisms that influence relationships, but one of the biggest is dismantled by that process, and you still might be have a dynamic with your family, and still might be triggered by things they do, but it's not that strong anymore.
Okay.
Yeah, and by the way, normally your near and dear ones, they don't intentionally push your buttons. It might be more correct that you push them for each other.
What do you mean?
Well, it's back to that coding mechanism, yeah, where you have complementary traumas and they kind of just hook into each other.
Okay, so they just unconsciously play out.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, if anybody's listening and you have family issues, well, talk to Daniel and talk to Inka about this stuff, because it is really common, and I feel like that's a very, very important topic for most people. Most people want their support system to be somebody they can, always rely on it, and that they can always be there for the people they love. And sometimes that's very difficult. And I feel like that's where a lot of our, you know, there's more as we're learning, like talking about this stuff. There's much more than just biographical traumas, but it does make things easier when the people around you and the people you love and you're around all the time aren't causing you more difficulty, and they're actually bringing more harmony, and you're bringing more harmony to each other, which is, the whole point of family. So there, let me see. I think I still have it, but I had one quick question. I know usually we go for about an hour and 30 minutes, so maybe we can talk about it in the in other talks a bit more in depth. But I feel like there's a big difference sometimes when we're talking about trauma and what people might go to regular therapy for, quote unquote regular therapy for, right? And I mean, it might be just like that we're using a different language, but I feel like a lot of the times it's the same exact thing. And a good example of this can be, sometimes people will go to therapy and they'll be like, something's wrong with me. Like, I don't know what I want to do with my life. I'm unhappy. Like, I'm not. I think something that happens a lot is like not knowing what you're supposed to do with your life, right? Like, some people feel like, I think that's something we've all experienced. Like, some people just know from the get go what they're supposed to do with their life, quote unquote. Like their job, their career, what they're meant to be here and do. So I feel like a lot of people struggle with not knowing, and I see that a lot in on social media alone, where people say like, like you'll get there, you'll figure it out, and your 20s are like this, your 30s are supposed to be like this. And I feel like really what we're talking about again is some sort of inability to see your strengths, or your inability to see your core self, your true self, your strengths. And sometimes when you are living in trauma, you're surviving. So sometimes what we do is we take on these roles that are survival roles, and we do the jobs that maybe present to us as opposed to the jobs that we're good at, because of a lot of things, like we don't believe in ourselves, or we don't, a lot of, self-limiting beliefs. And I feel like, again, that speaks to trauma, and that speaks to like the limitations and the comfort zones that we live in, because we have limitations based on trauma. Do you feel like people who go in for these kinds of things, where they feel more benign, they feel like they're just more confused, are really kind of the same thing? They're just talking about trauma with a different sort of language.
Well, in a way, yes. And in a way, you described that. For example, that person that still goes to that job, though he or she dislikes the job, there are emotional reasons for that. Of course, there are also factual reasons, and the person will tell you immediately, that's because I have to pay the loan, I have to pay that, or it's the best career opportunity, and so on. So they will make up factual reasons. But if you go there and ask them, well, how would you feel quitting? And then there's, there's fear. There's existential fear of not having enough money, or there's fear of never finding a job. And or there are other things like I'm not good enough to apply for another interview. So there are many emotions inside of us that let us create that factual model of why we do certain things, and that might be even the opposite of what the emotion is even about. And you can try to reinterpret your emotions. You can try to remodel that and then find a path. But to really be calm and peaceful about it, from my point of view, you have to heal that trauma. Okay, you heal that trauma, and the interesting thing, what happens then sometimes you might get even completely neutral about that job that you first hated. Okay, and then you just say, well, I'm doing it. Okay, and there are steps. Okay, it's not like you just do one round of tapping and then everything is healed, but there are some certain walls you put around yourself because of these emotions. You don't want to go this way, otherwise you feel shitty. You don't want to go this way, otherwise you feel that. And when you get rid of these emotions, these walls are torn down automatically because you don't need them anymore, and then you have a more free perspective of what you can do in your life. But on the other hand, you have 10, 20, 30, 40 years of experience of living your life within these walls. So that is something you need to learn, and you need to see if there might be even other traumas inhibiting you from going beyond it. We talked about the comfort zone, for example. So whenever an emotion comes up, an inside emotion, and there's a sensation, whenever you're not calm, peaceful, and emotionally light, there's trauma. And if you deal with it, then your life changes. It's in this general way to say how it will change is very difficult. Usually there are specific things like I'm afraid of spiders, so we work with that fear for spiders, or I'm afraid of flying, so we work with that fear of flying, and then it's gone, and then you simply can do it. But these perspectives of what you say, it's more like a personal development, personal growth perspective, where you say, okay, I'm not happy with my job. What I'm going to do? What am I going to do with my life? What's my purpose? What's my sense? What do I feel here? So these are not usually one session or 3 sessions things. These are longer coaching programs that you need to do to get rid of all these walls and then understand yourself better. What do you feel about that?
Yeah, I would agree with you. These are actually longer processes, and there is a way that we could teach you how to notice which kind of trauma is actually causing you to veer off a more optimal way of leading your life. So what we're not doing is, oh, we can see exactly your purpose in life is this. That's not what we're doing. But we can say, okay, you know what? If you're going to take this and this decision, it's trauma-based, and it will take you off from away from how you would optimally live your life.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's something you can work with people on specifically.
Yeah.
That's great. Okay, that's good to know, and that's important because I feel like it sounds like you're working with, like you said, it's not a one thing. Usually, it tends to be. I don't know if you guys use this word. I've heard it before, but like you're kind of peeling off like layers of trauma, right? You're to find the, well, in this case, like the optimal kind of path that you're supposed to take to lead the life you want, but. Just in general, like I've heard people talk about trauma as like, you know, you have layers of things you're trying to clear or clean, like cobwebs. I don't know if you guys see it like that. I know you tend to think about it more as like strings. So, but I don't know if the analogy works. But still, that's good to know. Is there anything else you guys want to add to that? That was my last question for you guys of the day. But if there's anything else you want to add, I would love to hear it.
No, thank you, Sergio. I think for our number 11, that's some beautiful topics we had today, and we'll be together very soon. I'm just looking for some new dates, and I will communicate them on Facebook together with you guys. And thank you very much.
Of course, Inka. Anything else you want to add?
I was thinking we could look a bit more into this, since you mentioned there are so many people who have a problem to figure out what they're going to do with their lives. There's also something that we call the optimal decision-making process, and we could talk about that a bit more next time.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds great. I'll keep a note.
We
of
have a
that.
cliffhanger.
Hey.
So if you don't know what you want to do with your life, join us for our next chat, number 12. We will let you know as soon as possible. We'll put it here on Facebook. Just also watch Daniel's videos on YouTube with our talks from Clubhouse now to Zoom. If you want to join, go ahead and ask any questions, right now or after. And you can also join on Zoom and we can communicate through the Q&A. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Inka, for taking the time to chat about this stuff. It's always a pleasure. And there's always more to learn, and there's always more to learn from you guys. So thank you so much. Seriously, it's a pleasure.
Thank you very
Thanks,
much
Sergio.
for beautiful moderation. Thank you very much.
Of course.
And beautiful questions.
Have a good day.
Okay. You too.
Thanks.
Bye.
Okay.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.
Be safe.
Bye.